Hello and welcome to this IELTS academic writing preparation lesson. Today we are going to focus on the academic writing task 1. Specifically, we'll be looking at an example with 2 bar charts. Now, these are considered to be the most confusing and difficult type of bar chart questions to get in writing task 1 because you have to look at 2 different sets of information, find correlations, and then write about it in 20 minutes. So stick with me. I'm going to walk you through this. We'll look at a strategy, a guide that you can use, and then we're going to look at a step-by-step example and a model essay. So let's get started. Now, as you may know, there are 3 different types of bar charts that you're likely to see on the IELTS academic writing section task 1. The first one is a bar chart with categories along the x-axis. The second type is a bar chart with dates or years on the x-axis, and this is very similar to a line graph, even though it is a bar chart. And the last and most infamous type is a writing prompt with 2 bar charts. So like I said earlier, you'll have to just look at 2 different sets of information and somehow connect them together. The main thing for this third type and the type that we'll be looking at today is to think about how these 2 bar charts are connected. This is really the main task of looking at this specific writing prompt. Now, here's a general guide that you can use for most bar chart questions. They will be tweaked and adapted depending on the bar chart that you have. But in general, you can expect 2 steps. So you've got step 1, you have to analyze the charts and plan how to group the information. We're actually quite lucky when it comes to this because we have to group the information per bar chart. So we're going to group one set of information for one bar chart and the other set for the other. So we have it a bit easy for step 1. And of course, step 2, we're just going to write an essay using the recommended essay structure, which we'll look at in just a bit. Now, looking specifically at our example today, our step 1 is going to be comprised of 2 tasks. First, we're going to organize the information based on the chart. So we're looking at the 2 charts separately in the beginning, and we're going to describe key information from each chart. Then, for our second half of step 1, we're going to summarize the general trends that we see in the charts. So we're going to do so across the 2 bar charts, and the main thing that we must do for this type of bar chart is find a correlation between the 2 bar charts. So the examiner has given you 2 bar charts to see if you can link the information together. We cannot just look at each bar chart separately and that's it. We really need to link them together. So first we're looking at them separately, summarizing the trends, and then we're going to find a link that brings them together. This is probably the biggest thing to tackle when it comes to this specific type of question, and it is the most difficult. So we're going to look at that today. So after looking at step 1, I want to show you the writing prompt and the 2 bar charts we're going to have today. Let's look at them. Now let's look at the text together, and then we'll look at the graphs. It says, the bar charts show education data related to young adults aged 15 years in 10 different countries in 2015. The first chart shows in which countries adolescents do the most homework in terms of hours per week. The second chart shows the nations that scored the best on an international science test. Summarize the data by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. And as we know, we have to write at least 150 words. Okay, so this is quite tricky. There's a lot to look at. Okay, but we would still approach this as we do with any other bar chart or line graph. We want to analyze the charts and plan how to group the information, and we're going to do so like this. So we have the first chart, which will be our body paragraph 1. I'll show you the outline in just a bit. And then the second chart is going to be our body paragraph 2. And like we saw earlier, we want to understand what is given in each chart. And then we'll look at finding that link. Now, if we look at the first chart, homework hours by country, it looks like students in Italy are spending the most time doing homework. And the least looks like it's Finland. So they have students doing homework around 2.8 hours, and Italy is at 8.6. You want to talk about this. So first off, I'm going to say that Finland has the least amount, okay? And then I'm also going to say that Italy has the highest amount. These are the key features from the first graph. And close to Finland is South Korea and Japan. It looks like students in South Korea and Japan are quite similar to those in Finland because they averaged about 2.9 to 4.3 hours. So I'm also going to include that when it comes to the least amount. I'll put SK for South Korea and Japan. Now, if we look at our second chart, it looks like Finland has the top science scores. So this is quite interesting because Finland spends the least amount of time doing homework, yet they had the highest scores. So we definitely want to include this. We see Finland's scores the highest. So I'm going to say highest scores here. And now, interestingly enough, if you look at the numbers, aside from Hong Kong and China, it looks like the most part of the countries are scoring around a 530. Interestingly, we don't even see Italy here on this top science score. We'll address that later. But just look at these scores here. It looks like we have 6 countries who are around a 530, more or less. But it's interesting to note that Hong Kong and China is above 530. So it's actually above this average. So I'm going to make a note of that as well, because that is a key feature. So I'm going to say that Hong Kong, and I'll put China in parentheses here, has around a 543. I'll put that that's interesting. And then I will say the 6 nations that we see here, I'm not going to list them, but I'm just going to say 6 nations scored around 530 points. And the fact that I don't see Italy on our list of the top 10 science scores in countries, I'm going to note that because it's quite interesting. They spend the most amount of time doing homework. So I'll put Italy not on list of top 10. And so we have fulfilled the requirements. We've looked at the key features in the first chart and the second chart, and we've made our notes. Now, when it comes to the second part of step 1, summarize trends, we've basically done this here in our notes. So we'll put here notes. And then for the correlation, if you compare and really look at the information in these 2 graphs, if we link them, there does appear to be a correlation between countries where children spend little time doing homework and higher science scores. So that is the link. The fact that Italy is not in our top 10 and the fact that Finland is number 1 really shows that there is a correlation between less homework or less time, fewer hours spent doing homework, and higher science scores. So we'll say here, correlation between countries, and I'll put least amount of homework and higher test scores. Remember, your outline and your notes do not have to make grammatical sense. They do not have to be perfect. As long as you understand and can reference them when writing, then they're good to go. So there you have it. It really didn't take that long. I spent extra time with you just to make sure that everything was clear. But we saw that the first chart was quite clear in the amount of hours spent by country. The second chart looks at mean test scores, and we can just make correlations based on the information we have. So we did find a correlation. We did summarize our trends. Now let's look at an outline that we're going to use for this specific essay, and then we're going to start writing. Now from our guide, we remember that step 2 is going to be actually writing the essay using the recommended essay structure. And that structure is as follows. So we have our introduction, our overview paragraph, body paragraph 1, and body paragraph 2. You might be familiar with this because we can use it for most of our bar charts. In the introduction, we are going to paraphrase the task question. In the overview, we are going to summarize the overall trend of the 2 bar charts. And then in our body paragraph 1, we are simply going to write about the first bar chart And in body paragraph 2, we're going to write about the second bar chart. So the correlation and the overall trends will be written about in the overview, and then each chart will have its own paragraph. So with this in mind, let's start writing. All right, so here we are. We're ready to delve into writing this essay. I've just made things a bit neater. I have our prompt right here above. I have our 2 charts below, and our notes are right here on the right-hand side. So I have my first chart notes, my second chart notes, and the correlation, which we will talk about in the overview paragraph. Of course, when you are writing your own practice and during the test, you do not want to write these headings. I'm just doing this so you can follow along with me. And at the end of this model essay, I'm going to show you a lot of great language that we were able to use, and we'll look at the word count and the reasoning behind certain word choices. Okay, now in our introduction, again, we are just going to paraphrase what we see here in our writing prompt. And so I'm going to say the first bar chart illustrates the number of hours spent by 15-year-old adolescents on homework in various countries in 2015. So note that I did not necessarily say 10 different countries. I said various countries. That's fine. It doesn't have to be word for word. In fact, it shouldn't. You should seek to paraphrase and use synonyms when possible. Now I'm going to talk about the second bar chart. I'm going to say the second chart highlights the top countries with scores recorded in science by the same age group, also in 2015, measured against an international standard. So we will look at the synonyms afterwards, but just know that this paraphrased introduction is basically what we saw in our question prompt. And that fulfills the requirements there. Now we're going to look at the overview paragraph. And this is just going to be very basic. It's going to be a correlation statement. And so since we're talking about something general, I'm going to say overall, there appears to be a correlation between countries where children spent little time doing homework and higher science scores. I am talking about the past tense just because we are looking at 2015. So that's why I have overall and where children spent little time. And that fulfills the overview paragraph. That is exactly what we found when we looked at the data. So I'm going to move on to body paragraph 1, where I'm talking about the first chart here. So I'm going to use the numbers that we see. Remember, I'm going to talk about Finland, South Korea, and Japan because they're the top 3. So starting off, I'm going to say of the top 3 nations by hour spent doing homework, Finland spent the least time, and I'll say 2.8 hours in parentheses, while South Korean and Japanese students averaged, and I want to look at the average. So we have 2.9 and 4.3. So I'm just going to say that. I'm going to say 2.9 and 4.3 hours respectively. So I know that this was 2.9 for South Korea, 4.3 for Japan. Then I'm going to go on and talk about the other countries. I'm just going to do a brief average. It looks like it was around 5 to 7 hours. So I'm just going to say time spent by students in other countries averaged between 5 and 7 hours. And here I do want to talk about Italy with the highest amount. So I'm just going to combine those two ideas, put a comma, and say, while those in Italy spent the longest time, and I'll put this in parentheses as well, 8.6 hours, which we see here in our chart, doing homework, which is over 4 times longer than those in Finland. So I have included this numerical part here because I want to show the difference. If we look at Finland, we know that 8.6 is over 4 times 2.8. And so I'm just using the numbers to my advantage. I'm really looking at the numerical data in our chart, and I just want to call that out. So it can definitely not hurt to use this information in your paragraphs, so keep that in mind. That is everything I wanted to write for the first body paragraph. So I'm going to move on to the second, where I'm going to talk about Finland, and I'm going to talk about Hong Kong and China and the other 6 nations. So since I'm being specific to Finland, I'm going to say, with respect to science scores, teenagers in Finland clearly scored the highest with a mean score of, and I want to look at the exact score, it's 568. So we have 568, despite spending the least time doing homework. And this really just agrees with the overview paragraph we have. So it's very clear here. It supports our overview paragraph. And then I'm going to talk about those other 6 nations, but I want to call attention to Hong Kong and China. So I'm going to say, aside from Hong Kong, and I will put China in parentheses just because we see it like that in our chart, with 543, I'll add that score as well. Adolescents in the next 6 nations scored around 530 points. So this was what we wrote here in our notes. Now, just to close this off, I do want to just touch on the lowest scores, even if we didn't really talk about it too much in our first chart. I'll just say that the lowest scores were recorded by Netherlands and the United States. And then I want to close off with Italy and say, interestingly, because it is quite interesting, Italy did not score within the top 10. And there we have it. So I have included the introduction, the overview, and I have talked about these 2 charts in each of the 2 paragraphs. I've added in the numerical data when necessary, just to back up my argument. Now I'm going to clean this up a little bit. We're going to look at a color-coded guide for 3 types of language that we should keep in mind. Okay, so I've cleaned this up quite a bit. We have our finished product here. Our word count for this essay was 191 words, so we've definitely fulfilled our minimum, and we haven't gone too far over. You don't want to go over 200 if possible. Now I have color-coded some words here. Let's take a look at the blue words. These are synonyms and topic vocabulary. So synonyms for perhaps some words in our writing prompt, or vocabulary that is specific to this task. And I have adolescence. This is great. We have it here. So be sure to use those keywords in your essay. So adolescence. Now, measured against is also great because measured against is specific to the second chart. So we know that the science scores are measured against an international standard, and that is from this sentence here. It says, the second chart shows the nations that scored the best on an international science test. And this is basically just another way to say that, but using measured against is a great way to show your examiner that you have a rich vocabulary. Now, when it comes to blue in our overview paragraph, doing homework and doing homework in our first paragraph as well is just good to add in, because remember, we have the verb do. So do homework. This is usually something that students confuse. They usually have the incorrect verb when it comes to homework. Some students would say make homework, and that is not correct. So make sure you have your verbs correct, your verb phrases correct, and take things from the writing prompt when possible. Now let's look at the green. These are useful vocabulary and phrases when it comes to bar charts and this type of bar chart comparison. So of course you want to say there appears to be a correlation. This is a great way to say there is a correlation, but it just makes it sound a bit more advanced. So there appears to be a correlation, averaged and respectively. So we used average because we're looking at the average here. So this was the mean test score. That's another way to say average. And respectively is excellent to use when you have two things. So we had 2.9 and 4.3 respectively. That just highlights that 2.9 refers to South Korean students and 4.3 to Japanese students. And then for this paragraph, we also had 4 times longer than. When you are making a comparison, really keep this in mind. You want to say how great the comparison is. In this case, we say 4 times. So 4 times longer than. You don't want to forget this last part of the phrase. And then at the very end, we had the top 10, just because we had 10 countries here. So this top 10 is just another way to say the top science scores according to an international standard, and it just adds another nice phrase. Lastly, we have our red phrases. Now again, when you want to say something general, overall is a great way to start that. Of the top 3 is an excellent way to be specific about 3 types of nations. And then I want to take a look at this sentence here. Now, I did not have 2 sentences. I wanted to combine this sentence. It is a complex compound sentence, but it really adds an advanced level of writing. So I am showing a contrasting idea, and while is an excellent way to introduce that. So it says time spent by students in other countries averaged between 5 and 7, while those in Italy spent the longest time. So I'm showing that this is different. Students in Italy actually spent longer, and so I've added while to show that distinction. Then for another specific paragraph, I have with respect to. It's a way to show that I am specific about science scores. So I'm talking specifically about this second chart. Despite is another great way to introduce a contrasting argument or statement where I have 568 as a mean score despite the least time doing homework. So these are contrasting ideas. The fact that Finland students spent the least time doing homework yet had the highest scores. So despite is a great way to link those two contrasting ideas. And then we have aside from. So that's basically saying, don't think about Hong Kong, we're talking about the rest of these nations. So it shows that there is a separation here. And then lastly, we have interestingly. And all it really does, it's a really important word that shows an interesting fact in that Italy is not in the top 10. And this statement is very important because our correlation paragraph is just saying that there is a correlation between less time doing homework and higher scores. And this last sentence really just supports that because Italy had students with the highest average of homework, yet they were not even on the list. So keep in mind that these vocabulary words, these synonyms really work together towards providing you with an advanced level of writing when it comes to the academic writing task. When it comes to task achievement, everything was great. We had our minimum word count. We even went above and beyond that. We answered the question. We looked at the charts separately and found the correlation. It was very coherent, it was cohesive because we followed our foolproof outline, and the lexical resource and the grammatical accuracy is contained right here. This was not an easy example, but we followed our outline, we followed our guide, and we got through it. Great job. Let's wrap up today's lesson. All right, so let's wrap up this lesson on 2 bar charts for things you want to do. Remember, you want to analyze each chart. This is very important. You want to plan how to describe the information that you see in each chart. Once you do that, you'll be able to understand the correlation. And this correlation is probably the most important part of this specific example. You have to understand both of those charts. So make sure you're spending enough time analyzing them and then understanding how they make sense together. Once you've done that, you can organize your essay. And things that you don't want to do not start writing the essay immediately. This is a great tip for anything really that you have to write on IELTS. You want to make sure that you're organizing things and understanding strategy before you start writing. But it is particularly true for this specific example. You have 2 things that you have to analyze, so make sure you're spending time, not too much time, but the adequate amount of time to really understand each chart. Of course, you don't want to write the wrong amount. This specific example has the risk of perhaps too much to write, so don't get carried away. You want to stick with 150 words minimum, and you don't want to go too much over 200. So just write the necessary things and the correlating information. And this goes with the first point. You don't want to lose time over two graphs, so make sure you're spending adequate time looking at the graphs and understanding them, but don't lose yourself or get carried away in looking at all of the details. Remember, you want to point out the key information for each graph and then the correlating information. All right, again, great job today. Thank you for sticking with me. This was not an easy example, but I hope that you were able to understand the strategy and apply it going forward. And if you're going to continue with your IELTS practice as you should, go ahead and visit us at www.bestmytest.com/IELTS. There we have other lessons when it comes to bar charts and other IELTS strategy and practice tests as well. So we'll see you there. In the meantime, have a great day. Thanks again.